Welcome back. Now let's take a look at one of our gameplay effects. I have Crystal Mana open here, and I'm going to scroll down, and because this gameplay effect has duration, we have the ability to configure its stacking options. Notice we have a stacking section, and we have a stacking type. And stacking type can be set to none, or aggregate by source, or aggregate by target. Now, it's set to none, and I want to see what happens when we pick up 2 of these, or maybe 3 or 4. So I'm going to take this mana crystal and duplicate it a few times, and I'll have these sort of all next to each other so we can pick them all up very rapidly. And let's see what happens with none as the stacking type. I'm going to pick all 3 up, and look at that, our mana goes up. And in fact, let's look at the numerical value using show debug. Our mana is set to 10, and if I pick up all 3 of them, look at that, it's going up really rapidly. Now that seems like stacking, doesn't it? But that's not what stacking really is. Without any stacking, we just apply the effect 3 times. Each one has its own duration, and they're all sort of being applied at the same time. And we end up getting 3 times as much mana as if we were to pick up just a single crystal, right? So that's the behavior without stacking. So what behavior do we get with stacking? Well, if we do have stacking and we choose one of these options, we can choose exactly what type of behavior we see. For example, let's say we wanted to pick up 1 crystal, and that crystal has a duration of 2 seconds. Well, what if during that 2 seconds we pick up another crystal? What behavior would we want to see? We don't want our mana increasing twice as fast. Maybe we want to still just increase mana at the same rate, but we want to refresh that duration. So say we pick up the first crystal, and 1 second in we pick up the second crystal. Maybe we just want the duration refreshed, so we get our mana increased for another 2 seconds. It's things like that that our stacking parameters allow us to configure. So the first 2 things we should talk about are these options for the stacking type, aggregate by source and aggregate by target. How do these work? So the first stacking type option, aside from none, is aggregate by source. Let's see how this works. Let's say we set our stack limit count to 2. Well, aggregate by source means that that stack limit count is enforced per source. So if we have 1 source and it applies a gameplay effect to the target, we count that as 1 stack of the gameplay effect, and it's aggregated on the source. So the source now has 1 stack count for this gameplay effect applied to the target. Now, the same source applies that same gameplay effect again, right? And we count this as the second stack, and that's aggregated by the source. Now, at this point, we have 2 stacks of the gameplay effect, and that's the limit. We set our stack limit count for this effect to 2. So if the same source applies the same effect again, this would be the 3rd stack, but that exceeds the limit, so this effect can't be applied. Now, we're aggregating by source, which means each source keeps a count of the stacks of this particular effect caused by the source. So, say we get another source in the game that applies this same gameplay effect. Well, we're aggregating our stacks by source. So for this source, this is only the first stack. And so we aggregate that stack by that specific source. So now the target has 2 stacks of this effect applied from the first source and 1 stack applied from the third. Now, that may seem to exceed the stack limit count, but we're aggregating by source. So we can have a maximum of 2 stacks per source applied to the target. Now let's compare this to the other option, aggregate by target. Before we were aggregating by source, now we're aggregating by target. So say we have a source, it applies the gameplay effect. This counts as a single stack, and this stack is aggregated by the target this time instead of the source. Now, that same source applies the effect again. This counts as the second stack, and that's added to the stack count, which is aggregated by the target. Now, the same source can attempt to apply another stack. That would be the third one, but of course that exceeds the stack limit count, right? So as we'd expect, that stack cannot be applied. But along comes another source attempting to apply this effect. And if we were aggregating by source, this source hasn't applied any stacks yet, but we're aggregating by target, and the target already has 2 stacks applied. So for this new source attempting to apply this effect, this would be the third stack on the target. And the stack limit count is 2. This would exceed that, so this effect cannot be applied. So that's the difference between aggregating by source and by target. By source means there's a limit per source, but by target means there's a limit per target. So in our case, let's say we choose aggregate by source and we set a stack limit count of 2. Now the duration I'd like to set to 1 second to make our math simple here. And the period is going to be 0.1, and I'm going to uncheck execute periodic effect on application. Now, this means that for 1 second, we'll execute our modifiers 10 times, and because we're adding 1 to our mana, we should see a total of 10 added to our mana over the space of a second per mana crystal, right? That makes sense. So let's duplicate one of the crystals and move it over here, press play, show debug ability system, and we see that our mana is 10. And if I pick up a single health crystal, I should see it go up to 20 within the space of a second. Makes sense. Okay, now we set our stacking type to aggregate by source with a stack limit count of 2. Well, what do we mean by source? Source is referring to actually an ability system component that's causing this. So we're causing this effect by actors. So in our case, it doesn't matter if we choose source or target, we're going to get a stack limit of 2 enforced. So we should only see our mana go up by 20 total. So we have 10. If we pick up all 3, we go up to 30, which is 20 more than we had before. So once we start having ability system components as the source, we should start being able to test that out. Now we have a stack duration refresh policy, and it says policy for how the effect duration should be refreshed while stacking, and it's set to refresh on successful application. If we choose never refresh, then even though we're adding stacks, that duration of 1 second is what prevails. So if we set this to never refresh, and we go on to pick up some mana crystals, I'm going to show debug. We have a mana of 10. I'm going to pick one up and then pick up another. Notice we didn't get all the way up to 30 because that full second had elapsed before we reached 30. So it doesn't matter how many stacks we have. This effect will expire at the end of a second no matter what. But with refresh on successful application, each time we stack another one on, it resets the duration and you get an additional second. Now we have a stack period reset policy, and this is similar to the duration refresh policy, only it's for the period itself. So if you're waiting for the next periodic change to an attribute, when we stack a new stack of this effect, reset on successful application means reset that period and start waiting for another full period. Otherwise, never reset means, well, we won't reset that period. And expiration policy is set to clear entire stack, which means as soon as this effect expires, all of the stacks are cleared. But you can choose to set this to remove single stack and refresh duration, which means that as the duration finishes, we remove a single stack and then the duration starts over again. So you can have 2 of these effects stacked on, And when the duration expires, the stack count goes down to 1, and then the duration count starts over again. So as you can see, we have a lot of options when it comes to stacking, and it really just depends on how you want these things to stack in your game. And throughout the project, we'll be creating lots of effects and choosing how they can stack. For now, for the mana crystal, I'd like to leave it at aggregate by target with a stack limit count of 2. I'd like to refresh the duration on successful application. I'd like to reset the period on successful application. And as soon as a stack expires, I'd like to clear the whole stack. And the duration can be left at 1. And the stack expiration policy, I'm going to set to remove single stack and refresh duration. That way, as we pick up more and more crystals, then we extend the duration and we can potentially gain more mana. So if I spread these out, we can kind of see the result of this combination of parameters. So I'm going to press play. I'm going to show debug, and I have 10 mana. If I pick up 1, I just get 10 more mana. If I pick up another one and then another one, I got 20 more. And that's because I refreshed that duration when I got a new stack. But if I start off with 10 and I pick up all 4 of these, notice that I only go up to 56, and that's because I'm picking them up one after the other, and each time I pick it up, I reset that duration. And notice that no matter how many stacks I have, I'm always just gaining 1 mana every 1/10 of a second. Whereas if we didn't stack at all, if I set this back to none, then picking up a whole bunch of these results in a very fast increase in mana. And setting it back to, say, aggregate by target with a stack limit count of 1, for example, then we can continue prolonging the stack duration, but always get the same rate of increase of mana. So let's pick up all of these, and we'll see that we increase that duration, but we're only ever getting 1 mana 10 times a second because we're limiting to 1 stack. So picking up a crystal before the previous stack expired simply resets the duration. So I know it's kind of a lot to take in, but we have a lot of options here, and we'll see how they can be combined and set up throughout the course. Now, the last of the stack expiration policy is refresh duration, which means that when this stack expires, refresh the duration. Even if it's the one and only stack, this essentially makes the effect infinite in duration because it keeps refreshing. So the comment says this can be used to manually handle stack decrements via on stack count change callback. So there's ways to respond to when the stack count changes, and we'll get to that. But if I set this to refresh duration, watch what happens if I pick up just a single crystal. We see that it keeps going and it never stops because each time the stack expires, we refresh the duration. So that's a way to get a sort of infinite duration periodic effect. I'm going to go ahead and leave this at clear entire stack. That way, as we can pick up multiple ones, we'll clear the stack completely as soon as that duration runs out. And before we wrap up, why don't we just go to the Crystal Heal gameplay effect and set its stacking type. I'm going to set it to aggregate by target, set a stack limit count of 1, and just like Crystal Mana, we'll leave it at refresh on successful application and reset on successful application. And just like Crystal Mana, we'll leave it at clear entire stack as well. And that way we've got a little bit of throttling if we pick up too many at the same time. So great job. We now know about stacking, and I'll see you in the next video.